Hi. Can everybody hear me all right? Hopefully. Maybe. Okay, hooray. Thank you. Okay, well then let's go ahead and get started. I tried to put together a really brief PowerPoint so that we could leave as much time as possible for questions. So what I've got planned here is basically a brief reorientation for Table 3, just to talk about what it is and what it covers, since most of us haven't really focused on this one in a while. And also to talk about how we're using the data, both and how to put together the table itself. There's specific mechanics that we find particularly useful when you're constructing the table. It makes it a lot easier for us to work with it. And to that end, then just a brief rundown of the outcome and impact indicators that we collect in Table 3. I'm focusing on specifically how we report and what that table looks like, although we can definitely discuss any definitions, data collection, anything else that comes up in the question and answer period. So I'm planning on running through the slides pretty quickly, but definitely stop me if there are any questions, because that's really the purpose of today. So everybody has seen this slide before, but I think it sort of bears repeating to just remember, although this is, we're leading up to the very first time that we're collecting our Table 3 data, but this is something that we've been working towards since the very beginning of the project. So we've got a development hypothesis for farmer to farmer. We start with our inputs. These are volunteer assignments, basically. That leads to our outputs. The volunteer recommendations, people trained, these are things that we've been reporting since the beginning of the project. We're getting into our first reporting on the outcomes, volunteer recommendations. This is where our hosts really change behavior, and then the impacts, productivity and income increases, financial services increases, organizational development increases, and environmental capital. So we've been collecting data on the inputs and outputs since the very beginning of the project, but we're coming to our first reporting on outcomes and impacts. So we're really, for the first time, going to be able to see the results of everything we've been doing since the beginning. So although it's new reporting, it's not actually new work. So yeah, the very basics on, these all have a couple of different clicks in here, so that'll get obnoxious. So just the basics on Table 3, it presents the outcome and impact indicator data. The categories are beneficiaries, economic, environmental, financial services, and organizational impact indicators. We also look at recommendations made and adopted, which are output and outcome indicators. We also report on host demographic indicators. So these are not really expected to change over time, but those demographic indicators really help us link the data in Table 3 directly back to Table 2. So it's important to remember Table 3 presents data on every single host organization you worked with. If it's in Table 1, it should be in Table 2, and if it's in Table 2, it should be in Table 3. Regardless of whether or not you expect to see any impact or can even collect impact data, you still need to have that host in there. So it shows actual annual figures, not change or increase. In the past, farmer to farmer has reported in Table 3. We've reported change from baseline. I really want everybody to remember we're not reporting change, we're reporting actual annual figures. And then we only require Table 3 twice over the life of the project. So the FY16 annual report, if you're preparing it for the midterm, relax. You do not have to turn it in with the midterm, with the semi-annual report. It should just be in the annual report this year for FY16. And then the only other time it's required to be reported is in the FY18 annual report, the very final. You're welcome to turn it in any other time. We will always review the data and give you any feedback on it, but it's only required those 2 times over the life of the project. So to get into the purpose of Table 3, definitely it lets us monitor our performance. This is our first look at the outcome and impact data, so it's a good chance to assess how we're doing. You know, are the inputs, the volunteer assignments, and everything really doing what we expect it to be doing? And do we need to make any course corrections? You know, it's seeing the data while we still have time to make changes if we need to is really fantastic. So it also helps us focus our efforts along those same lines, see where we're getting results and when we're not getting results, and either plan to continue or end work or put more effort into things where necessary. It also lets us tell the story. So it's really important for outreach. It's our first set of real data demonstrating what we're accomplishing. So, you know, we've been able to write success stories so far, but it's really sort of anecdotal. This is our first chance to see hard data on what we're accomplishing. So, oh, it's also useful to me, data calls. We get that a lot, and this is the first time we can really show impact. So to really help us, help USAID, to help with the comparison and data consolidation, there's some specific mechanics that need to be observed in composing the table that will let us compare Table 3 directly to Table 2 baseline data, and that will help us in our consolidation efforts so that we can see those early trends. So now we'll get a little bit more into mechanics. There's Table 4 or Table 3. Isn't it beautiful? It's really hard to see because it's huge. There are a million pieces of data that go into this, but we're going to break it down a little bit more. So just as a reminder, every single host should be included. So again, if it's in Table 1, it should be in Table 2, and we've been checking that to make sure that that's happening already. But remember, if it's in Table 2, it must be in Table 3. And there are lots of reasons that you may not be able to collect impact data for Table 3, and that's fine. If you can't get updated data, just report the baseline data again. And then at least it's represented, and we'll be able to see when we compare Table 2 and Table 3, okay, no change. That's fine.
What if the host dies or goes bankrupt?
Same thing. Just put it in there.
Zeros?
No, don't report zeros. Report the baseline data again.
Okay, if they're dead, there's still baseline.
Yeah.
We don't want to show negative.
Yes. So when we compare Table 2 and Table 3, if you report zeros, then it's going to show a negative result, like Danny said. So just report the baseline if you don't have updated data. Also, hosts should be listed in the same order that they are in Table 2. This is very silly, but also incredibly important. When Gary and I get all this data in and go to compare Table 2 to Table 3, you will save us immeasurable amounts of time if you just report everything in exactly the same order, so we can just write one formula and carry it all the way across. So just as a reminder, things are in Table 2, everything is ordered by fiscal year, so date of first completed assignment, and then within each fiscal year by country, and then within each country by country project. So you can just copy exactly what you did in Table 2, and that's the best way to do it, so that everything is in exactly the same order. So that'll really help us isolate the change between the baseline and the follow-up reporting, and we'll just like you better if you make our jobs easier like that. Also, just a quick thing to keep in mind for that, the order of the indicators is really important for helping us with these kinds of things as well. Maybe whatever system you're using spits out the indicators in a slightly different order and puts financial services ahead of economic indicators. Just rearrange those, please, before you turn them into us, because we will probably catch it eventually, but it can lead to a lot of confusion and misreport your data in the meantime, which is easy to avoid. So it's better if we just start with that. Okay, so I can no longer advance slides. Oh, well, that was easy. So just to go through really quickly the different categories of the indicators, these are the host demographics. So host name, country, country project, date of impact assessment, host gender, and institution type. We don't really expect these to change over time, although some of them might, particularly host gender or institution type, if the host organization you're working with undergoes some major changes. So that's fine, but we expect that to be minimal. When you report this data in Table 3, it allows us to connect Table 2 and Table 3. Basically, that's the key part of that connection, and that's part of the reason that we include this data first. It makes sure that we're understanding and matching up those hosts correctly between those two different tables. And this also allows us to understand and meet requests about the type of hosts with which we work. That's particularly for institution type that, we're testing out host standard as well. So beneficiaries, we're looking at actual beneficiaries. I know there's been, the standard indicator definitions are out of date. We do have that update that makes clear that indicator number 16, actual beneficiaries for Table 3, is looking at actuals, not potential. So I'll send that out shortly with that updated definition. I know that's been a question for a while. So members and owners, employees, clients and suppliers, family members, and then we wrap that all up into total beneficiaries. So it ties directly back into that potential beneficiaries indicator, number 13 in Table 2. So we do a comparison there. It's also, this is an interesting indicator because in Table 2, the beneficiaries is not actually a baseline. It's a measure of the potential reach that we may have. So when we look at it in Table 3, we're not necessarily expecting to see an increase here. A lot of times what we think of our measures of success being increases from the baseline to the impact. That's not something we're looking for with actual beneficiaries. We expect actually in most cases that this number will decrease from what we have in the baseline, because we're not, in Table 2, when we look at the potential beneficiaries, we're looking at basically anyone connected with the host that we think could possibly benefit. We're looking for our outreach potential. Whereas in Table 3, we're looking at actual beneficiaries. Who did we actually reach? Who actually benefited as a result of the work that we did? So we expect that to be a much smaller number. It may not be. If there's been a big change in the host organization and suddenly they have 3 million clients as a result of farmer-to-farmer assistance, that number may go up. But really, we expect that to go down significantly because we're looking at actual impact, actual reach, as opposed to the complete universe of who we may potentially work with, as we present in Table 2.
In supplier role, how do you assess how many of them? Is it a number that's to report? Yes. So the client and supplier sometimes in the survey is a group of people. So it would be, for example, the market right next to the village. How do you report that? Because we don't have the number of clients.
Yeah, so that clients and suppliers are a really challenging indicator, and we're sort of trying to feel our way through some revisions, I think probably for the next round of farmer to farmer, if and when that happens. I think this is really working contextually with your field staff and with your host organizations to see what really meaningfully makes sense. So if you're working with a host organization if they're already working in a market and just nobody comes by their market stall, and you're trying to help them expand the number of clients that they're reaching through that market, then to the extent possible, it makes sense to count the people who they're actually selling to. Whereas if you've got an organization that, hey, we go to this market, but we're trying to expand our reach throughout the country, then it probably makes more sense to count each individual market. Well, we started out in selling at one market, but now we have stalls at 2 other markets. So then it would make more sense to count, okay, the clients are three different markets. So it's a hard one. It's a hard one to measure, and I think we just kind of have to acknowledge that it's sort of a notional indicator rather than something that we can compare directly one-to-one across all hosts.
There's probably apt to be a big difference in size. You'll have small businesses where they know they have 10 suppliers, and then there are large input dealers that have 30,000 customers, which kind of swamps the whole aggregation process.
Yeah.
And one you can have definite counts, the other is an estimate.
Yeah. So this is one of those indicators that really, when you aggregate it, it stops making a lot of sense. It makes a lot more sense for the individual hosts comparing Table 2 to Table 3 directly. So it really sort of depends on, we're really relying on your field staff and the specific data collection methods there to do what makes sense. Yeah. Anything else on beneficiaries? Okay. So the economic impacts. We're looking at, I'm going to take these out of order a little bit. So gross sales and net income work together really well, and there's basically no change in the indicator between what you report in Table 2 and Table 3. It's 1-to-1. It's actually the same indicator. When you look at the area under improved production technology, though, this one gets a little bit tricky for a couple of different reasons. First of all, this one is like beneficiaries. So the baseline isn't necessarily a true baseline. It's really a measure of our potential. Obviously, it's a measure sort of our potential sphere of influence in Table 2. But in Table 3, we're actually trying to look at what has actually changed, what area of land is actually under improved technology use. So this is another one where we actually expect this to go down considerably, and that's not a bad thing. This isn't really, we're not comparing this indicator in Table 2 with this indicator in Table 3 isn't gonna give us a measure of the host's success. They're not really comparable that way. So, so don't worry about that one going up. We actually really expect it to go down. It may not, but that's really the tendency we're expecting to see.
If it goes up, we'll be very suspicious because it means you did a very poor job of estimating the potential.
Or, you know, maybe the host got a massive land grant, but that's probably unlikely. So if it goes up, I'm probably going to ask you questions about it. And it may be fine, but I'm probably going to ask you questions about it. So the other thing that makes this one tricky is it can be very easily confused with the environmental indicator that's measuring land area. So the important thing to remember there is oh, I've got it written down right here. Okay, so the economic indicator here, area under improved production technology, looks at productive or economic interventions. So those are the ones with objectives relating mainly to increasing income and productivity for the host organization. So it's possible that a parcel of land that you counted as environmental in Table 2, when you actually, you know, when you were just assessing potential, when you actually have a volunteer work with the host organization, you may find that they're using that particular parcel of land to increase their income or productivity. And then you just, in Table 3, count it as an economic indicator, and that's fine. We're not going to be making those one-to-one comparisons between Table 1 and Table 2. So we're going to compare those two land area indicators, the economic and the environmental, in Table 2 to each other, and then in Table 3, we're going to take a look at those indicators together. But we're not, the connection between those two indicators and the Table 3 indicators, it's not tremendously meaningful, just because, you know, they're measuring completely different things, potential and then actual work. So we expect that number to go down, and please don't confuse it or double count it with the environmental indicator, which is especially important because our environmental indicator, you guys, we only have one. So if it gets conflated or confused with the land area indicator for economic impacts, we really sort of miss out on anything we're doing in environmental and natural resource management. So basically the same things that apply to that economic land area indicator apply to the environmental. We do really expect that the number of hectares is going to go down for individual hosts because, again, we're not looking at potential, we're not looking at our grand sphere of influence, we're looking at actual change. And please don't double count those or mix them up. For the environmental indicator, we're looking at environmental interventions, which are those with objectives relating mainly to environmental conservation, protection, or more environmentally conscious management. A lot of times those can be either or. You know, if somebody's installing a drip irrigation system, is that to increase productivity or decrease cost, or is that to be more environmentally conscientious? you could probably realistically count that for either one. So it's really up to your field staff to make that judgment and determination. No, you can't double count the land. If you want, you can split it. You can count half for economic and half for environmental, and that's fine. But it should not be double counted. So in table 2, basically, when we're looking at the potential, if we were to add up those 2 indicators, the economic and the environmental, it should not be more land area than that host actually has influence over. So it doesn't have to be the total land area that organization has influence over, but it shouldn't be more. There should be no double counting there. And of course, that you can't really do a check on that in table 3 because we're expecting this to be considerably less land area than the host organization has influence over overall. We really kind of don't expect that as a result of farmer-to-farmer interventions, the host organization is going to completely change their productive and environmental practices on all of the land that they own or have influence over. But definitely make sure you're avoiding double counting those.
I think, again, whether this rule of thumb is useful or not, do what makes sense and do what's relatively easiest. There's no point in splitting or agonizing over it too much. But a question, if you have increase in productivity or production profit, do you have to have some land area?
Yeah, I think so.
Sean?
Yeah. It's also possible that, if you're a processing facility or something, you may be increasing your production of canned goods without any land area, but then that shouldn't show up in your indicator tables. That should show up in, it should show up in new and improved products and services, which is actually not the next set of indicators. We're looking at financial services next. The most important thing to remember about your financial services indicators is that these are only for host organizations that are issuing loans. So if an organization receives a loan, that's fantastic. Don't report it here. It gets reported someplace completely separate.
Which is unfortunate for Land of Lakes, which has a financial services country project that is working with the borrowers. So they don't get to show any increased lending in this area, even though that's the objective of their project.
I think that's the most important thing about these indicators. One of the interesting things about, since for table 3 now we're reporting actual annual figures rather than increase, we should be able to compare these 2 indicators and divide value of agricultural lending by number of agricultural loans and actually see the average loan value, which is something we were not able to do in the past when we were just reporting income. So I think this change is actually going to be really helpful for us in terms of, I think we're going to be able to pull more meat out of these indicators because of the way we've changed the reporting. Just a fun little aside. So our organizational impacts. I'm going to set the ODI aside for a minute because new and improved products and services is easier. Hey, if someone improves production, if it's a crop that they're growing, that can go here. If it's something that they're processing, if it's a new loan product, anything like that. If it's new from when we started working with the host as a result of farmer-to-farmer assistance, or if it's significantly improved, it gets to be counted here. One important thing to remember about this indicator is that it has no counterpart in table 2. We are not tracking the baseline number of products and services that your host organization has or is offering. So defining new or improved is really up to you guys. It's up to your record keeping to be able to say, okay, this is what they started with and this is what they have now. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. That's not something we can verify. It's up to your records. So ODI, everyone's favorite indicator. I think the most important thing to remember on this on this one is there is a Table 2 baseline for the ODI, and Table 3 is reporting any change in the ODI. We're not looking for the highest number. We design the ODI such that small organizations, large organizations, simple organizations, complex organizations, all of them should be able to show, over time, they should be able to show change and ideally improvement. So whether an organization changes from 3.5 to 3.7 or 1.1 to 1.3, to us, that's a 0.2% change. That's the exact same amount of improvement for both of those host organizations. So that's an important thing to remember. When we compare Table 2 to Table 3, a 4 is exactly the same as a 2. It's really, we're looking at the change, not percent change, not how high they are on the scale. So there's no need to inflate those numbers. And I know organizations really want to be able to show progress. What we're kind of expecting is that at the midterm, a lot of organizations are going to have a decreased ODI score from their baseline, because the theory is kind of that as you start working with volunteers and with our field staff, organizations are likely to identify more issues with their organization than they necessarily thought there were to begin with. So we're kind of expecting to see an initial dip in the ODI ratings and then an increase in the final. So if that happens, don't be concerned about it. It's kind of what we expect. If it doesn't happen, that's perfectly fine too. We're going to learn from that. But we're not necessarily expecting to see a huge increase here. So it's really not a problem if that's not what happens. Also, it's important to remember as well as the ODI is meant to be a planning tool as much as it is a diagnostic or an assessment of a host organizational capacity. So getting an updated ODI score, we hope, will not only be interesting for us in terms of seeing the progress that a host has made since the baseline. We also hope it will be helpful for you and your field staff and the host organization itself in planning what they need to work on through the end of the project. So the last one is indicators. These are actually, number of recommendations made is actually an output. It's the only output in this table. And then it's compared with recommendations adopted, which is an outcome. But we also know recommendations made is reported in Table 1 by volunteer assignment. We're also trying to re-report basically the same data, but cut a different way, by host organization rather than by assignment. This is the first time that we're presenting the data this way, and we're hoping it'll let us see, sort of compare recommendations made to recommendations adopted, which is mostly just interesting. What we've heard anecdotally in the past is that about 80% of recommendations made have been adopted. That's one data point, and it's anecdotal. So, I don't know if that's good or bad. I don't know if an increase or a decrease from that is good or bad. Mostly, we're just interested to see what the data comes back like here. We're also kind of hoping. We've been talking a lot, I think, over the first couple of years of the project about reducing the number of recommendations to make it just manageable for not only for host organizations, but also for field staff in terms of actually tracking what changes are made. So we expect that that the number of recommendations made and thus number of recommendations adopted is sort of the low end of what your field staff and your volunteers are actually working with the hosts on. These are the most important, most realistic recommendations. So that's an important thing to keep in mind there.
We sincerely hope that when we total the volunteer recommendations by host, it equals the total by volunteer.
Yeah.
And 80% adoption is, I would say, incredible. There's suspicious might be another term that comes to mind. There's a lot of volunteer, I mean, looking at the volunteer recommendations, some of them aren't that easy. Some of them are always going to be wrong. And so 80 would be, it's extremely high.
Yeah. So we're hoping that the number of recommendations made will match, but we know it's possible that may be off a little bit just in terms of maybe a volunteer made the same recommendation to two different hosts. You know, if they've worked with hosts either in the aggregate or did a very similar scope of work on one assignment with multiple hosts. So that could, you know, if that number winds up being off, if it's off by a little bit, I probably won't ask you about it. If it's dramatically off, I'll suspect that there's a problem. But, you know, that's something that we think may happen. I don't know. We'll see. This is the first time we're reporting this data. So I also realized in putting this together, I have somehow managed to cut off the value of resources mobilized by the host, which is an important indicator. It also doesn't have a counterpart in Table 2, so this will be the very first thing that we're seeing. It's an interesting indicator. It's the very last part of the leverage on the project that hasn't been reported yet. So this is, you know, when we talk about the financial indicators, we really stress that if an organization receives a loan, don't report that in a financial indicator. If an organization receives a loan as a result of volunteer assistance, that should go in resources mobilized by the host. You know, if as a result of farmer-to-farmer assistance an organization qualifies for a grant, that should go in resources mobilized by host. Those kinds of things. And this, you know, especially since it doesn't have a baseline, we don't have a sort of threshold for good in mind with this one. It's mostly something that's interesting to see, you know, what happens. What are the hosts actually accomplishing here? Oh, hey, you have all sorts of resources for this. You've got your standard indicator definitions, which are about to be updated momentarily with that actual beneficiaries definition. You've got your indicator table templates. Please use these when you're preparing your table so that everything is in order, everybody's consistent. The M&E do's and don'ts list, which Gary sent out last month, I don't think it's been updated since the last time we sent it out last year because nothing's really changed, but please do, when you prepare your table, go through that quickly and make sure that you've followed everything, and it just saves everybody time. The ODI template, of course. And when this PowerPoint goes out, there's a hyperlink to the M&E training on the farmertofarmer.org site. If you have not reviewed the impact indicators, you know, there's no getting enough of Eric's voice and my voice. Everybody needs more of both of those in their life. So please do a quick scan through that. You don't even have to listen to it. You could just read the notes. There's a transcript that goes along with it. So it's a good thing for you to review. It's a good thing for the field staff to review. We really hope everybody's doing that before every annual report. So please take advantage of it. And let's do questions. And if you have questions or if you've already asked questions, can you please make sure you write them down, and we'll update the presentation to reflect that when we send it out.
And so maybe before we launch into Q&A, would it be helpful to go around the room and do quick introductions and also find out who's on the phone?
Yeah, that would be excellent.
So sorry I didn't do this earlier, but if we could all just introduce ourselves.
Sure. Yeah. I'm Courtney Dunham. I'm the Senior Program Officer with Partners of the
Okay.
I'm Angela Krzyzewski. I'm Program Associate with Winrock International.
Andy Thomas, Senior Program Officer with Partners of the Americas.
Gary Alex, USAID.
Linda Kovu, Program Associate with NCBA CLUSA.
Virginia Bunker, Program Associate with NCBA CLUSA.
Robert Landman, Independent Consultant and former Deputy Director General of the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation in Agriculture.
I'm Eric Wallace. I'm a Director at ACDI VOCA.
Aaron Bays, Program Associate at USAID.
Laura Alexander, Program Director at SEGA.
Leah D'Amboise, Program Manager at SEGA.
Amy Jackson, Santa Fe.
Rachel Slinger, Program Coordinator at SEGA.
And it looks like we have a number of people still on the phone. If you guys could introduce yourselves.
Anya Magalinska from CNFA.
Anyone else on the phone?
Yes, I am Jorge from Farmer to Farmer, Colombia.
Great, thanks, Jorge. Anyone else on the phone? Philip,
Yeah, from Tennessee State University.
Thanks, Philip. All right, then, Philip, thanks to all. Let's go ahead.
Questions? Anybody?
I do have a question from over here. This is Anya from CNFA. I was wondering, beyond just the requirements of the reporting, the tables themselves, I know that in the past rounds, for example, some of our offices have produced more, a deeper analysis of specific hosts or done things beyond just the requirements of the reporting. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the experience of that from past rounds, what some of the organizations have done, how that was used before.
Yeah, I think a lot of that came in the final report from the last round. I know there are some specific things that one can pull out from the data or from the component pieces of the data that gets reported. You know, employment statistics is one of them. That's kind of an interesting thing. But Gary, do you have anything specific to say about some of the analysis that came in with the final reports?
Yes. These indicators are the lowest common denominator in many ways. We're aggregating across countries and projects and things, and they're useful indicators to us, but they don't really tell the whole story. They rarely tell the whole story on a host. And there are a number of ways that I think implementers have gone beyond this, well beyond this, to do what's useful and instructive in learning how the program's working. And I think what you're talking about mainly is in the last, well, through several of the last programs towards the end, some of the implementers did special studies that looked at the results of working with certain types of hosts or specific hosts or industries to see in more depth what had happened. And those were in some cases quite interesting. And I think that can be good practice if you're working in a specific area. Looking at just these indicators isn't going to tell the story. We do appreciate the success stories from an individual volunteer assignment or a host and the results from that. Those are kind of one-off on the host. Aggregating those and looking at it, sort of work with all producer organizations or work with all nut growers, producers, can be interesting. And that doesn't have to be done at the end of the project. I know some implementers do their own internal evaluations, which can look at a specific issue. And that's a good opportunity to look in more depth at what is happening, what's working, what's not, and to get a good deal of learning from that. So we very much encourage that and encourage including that in as attachments in your annual report, or when you do them as one-off reports, please share those. And I think it's very useful to know better what's going on and looking at how you can improve programs. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
I had a question about the area indicators. So So let's say, for example, a host organization put down 100 hectares under the economic or the productivity indicator. So are we essentially going back and asking, of this 100 hectares, how much is actually under improved productivity and income? And then if they report something that's environmental, when we don't have that from before, we're not reporting anything under the environmental indicator, or would we report that as well?
So I think the question should be not of what you reported before, but just have you improved production practices on your land? You know, how much land, you know, on how many hectares? And then the same question for the environmental practices.
Okay, so we would still ask both, even if we had identified at the beginning that they only want economic.
Yeah, I would ask both questions, and then based on what they tell you there, then make sure that those are distinct parcels of land. You know, maybe they're saying, okay, we have 100 hectares total, and we improved production on all 100, and we also improved environmental on 20 of those 100. Okay, well, you know, let's figure that out, because it shouldn't be, you can't double count that 20 hectares of land that has improved environmental and productivity.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So that might be a case where the numbers would go up, though, because then they've reported initially that, well, our focus is going to be economic, but then we, you know, installed drip irrigation systems, which actually have more of an environmental focus, so then it's going to go to zero.
Yeah, exactly.
Of the implementers here, now you've got a lot of hosts. I don't know how many, 100, 150 sometimes. What % do you think you'll be able to resurvey? Do you have a feel for that? Is it going to be 90% or 60% or?
I'd say closer to, based on just a guess, I'd say probably closer to 60.
All the hosts who have had we're going to have issues.
There will be some flexible assignments in other countries you won't be able to.
I think it also depends on how recently we worked with the host. So the majority of the hosts from this past year was, if it needs a full other cycle to see the effects, we won't be going back to those, the approach that I assume we would be doing, and we would just go to the ones that, for example, if the recommendation was to look back within the next 6 months, and if that period hasn't passed yet, then it's not ready for impact data to be collected.
Yeah, we're not expecting any. So for hosts that show up in Table 2 for the first time this round, we're not expecting to see any results in Table 3, although please do report at the baseline in both tables.
What do the field staff say about this monitoring, the surveying, and any, they take it in stride, or is there any no major issues?
Well, they usually caution us that, like, hosts are hard to get a hold of. They go out of business, they disappear, they move. You know, they exhort us to be patient with them about that.
We've actually found that a lot of our field staff are kind of excited for this because they haven't been able to really see a lot of change, and they've been working hard with fielding volunteers and not really being able to know what impact it has. So we found that a few of the countries have been pretty excited about it.
That's good.
I think our field staff is most worried about the workload in managing both assignments with also managing all these impact surveys that they're going back, because we have high targets year in, year 3.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
Are there any other questions maybe from the phone?
Oh, yeah, I just have one other question. I was just wondering what your experience has been, kind of Aaron maybe, who has seen this data collection in many areas, but done by many different program coordinators in the past. When you go back to collect this impact data and you're kind of trying to tease out the information during the interview, how have you seen the kind of leading the question type of way of asking questions? So for example, under the, well, last time when we came, you reported this, so what is it now? Versus just asking them without the background context so that it doesn't lead the question so that automatically they say, oh, okay, well then I guess it's 10,000 more, and they calculate from there. What has your experience been in the way that the questions are phrased and the way that that program coordinators have best managed to do it in a way that doesn't lead too much, that doesn't lead the answer too much?
Yeah, so I don't actually have a lot of experience collecting this data at the host level. It's something that we really rely on the field staff to take care of most. You know, I think as you were alluding to, the best practice is probably to lead that as little as possible. You know, collect it the same as you would baseline data. Sit down and have a conversation, you know, a fresh conversation. Hey, what's your income? You know, I probably wouldn't go about it exactly like that, but you know, ask about this year's data, not as a comparison. Especially since, you know, there are a handful of these indicators that really aren't a comparison to the baseline. You know, we really want to know, where are they now? So I think that's probably the best practice there. If you're having trouble collecting information, it may be useful at some point to remind them, you know, what they reported before. But it's also important here to remember that as much as possible, we like to have this corroborated with documentation. That's not always possible, but at least with multiple sources within a host organization, if it's possible to get that as well, especially for something like an ODI where you're going on a host organization's assessment, not necessarily something that you can have hard records on. So, you know, a lot of times I think we wind up having to triangulate the data anyway, just because they're poor records kept, or people just don't know exactly how much land area they have, for instance. So if you can get multiple sources for things, whether that's multiple individuals telling you information, or, you know, seeing documentation to back up figures that someone in the organization is reporting, that's also a good practice as well.
I think that comment on the documentation is important, that it's good practice. Some of this will require calculations. Incomes, you may have to calculate the price, the amount of product sold and the price, and come up with estimates. And whatever you're doing, it's good if the field staff can keep notes and keep it in the field in case an evaluator comes back to spot check and ask, okay, how did this farmer group increase its income? And yeah, you got something to go to get the answer to that.
Other questions from the room or on the phone? We have about 7 minutes left, I think, within our time, so we could probably take one or two more.
I think the question earlier about the documentation or special studies, also relevant, that I know in most of your programs, the documentation on the host survey information, there's much more information there than what we get in these indicator tables, and that's important. So recognize that, and that's a real resource.
Yeah. Yeah, if you find useful information like that, or interesting trends, feel free to throw those into either an annex to the report, or talk about that in the body of the report itself. Those are, you know, like Gary said, the indicator tables are sort of the lowest common denominator. What do we need, and what can we realistically collect across the wide variety of countries and types of projects and types of hosts that we work with? But if you're able to collect other specific data or identify other trends, that's interesting and useful.
But does that mean that we should or should not be making that a priority, or what type of studies then would be helpful, for example, for applying for the next round to prove that it is a successful project beyond the regular indicators?
I don't think we can answer that. You'll have to look at, and I think you can answer that, I mean, collectively in your team, what's going on, what is successful, what do we wonder about, and you can tease out lessons there. It's very country and situation specific, I believe.
Yeah.
But it's good to always be asking questions.
Going back to your comment on stories, one thing that I mean, I'm new in collecting royalties, but one thing I noticed is that, for example, in the income, sometimes the host organization doesn't have any bookkeeping, any record of the income, but still you still have a number of that is there on the survey. So how do you go about evaluating that this number is accurate?
Yeah.
That's why you have to keep good notes. The field staff have to. They're working with a group of 15 village women and men that sell radishes. When they do the baseline, they probably do a calculation that on average they sold 50 pounds of radishes each at so much price, and so they do the calculation and keep that in the file of the host. And then 3 or 5 years later, when they go to do it again, do a similar calculation. It's going to vary by pretty much by host.
Yeah, especially when you're collecting the baseline information, but really anytime you do data collection, this is part of why it's so important to keep records on how you arrive at the data that you have. Whenever these tables are reported, I always have a million questions for everyone. Some of it there may be problems with data, it may be problems with what's reported, it may be problems with our consolidation process. I don't think it's a problem to have a huge list of questions that I'm going back to y'all with. It's not necessarily an indication that there's a problem with the data. Gary and I just need to make sure that we understand, and we don't get concerned unless it takes you forever to answer the question, because what that tells us is, we don't have records. We don't know how we got this number or what this number means. We can't tell if it's correct or not. We have to basically recreate it. So having that, keeping that information on how you arrive at those numbers right from the start is really important. Not only for going back and trying to assess change or impacts over time, but also it helps you do quality control on your own data, and just be able to do that with confidence. This is how we arrived at what we have here. This is why. This is how we assessed it the way we did.
I think too. Okay, these are pain tables. Well, I'll admit that. But use them as a tool too, and I think it can be a very useful tool for your field staff to keep them focused on, okay, what is it we want to accomplish? What is it the hosts want to accomplish? Do they want to conserve more land or water resources? Do they want to increase incomes? And so it's not just a matter of moving volunteers through, but accomplishing something with the host, meeting them. So I think there's a lot of potential for using this to keep field staff focused on objectives.
Great. Other final comments? Well, I want to thank everyone for participating and having a really robust discussion, as well as thank Erin for going over the indicators one more time. I have a couple questions more related to the brown bags that Vega is going to be having over the course of the next year. This has been the first for 2016, and we will have a few more. I don't want to take time to have a discussion about it, but if you have any ideas about a good topic for a brown bag that's relevant, especially to farmer, but even if something's relevant to a larger volunteer sending community, please let me know. I'll share my contact information as well as all of the resources discussed today and the PowerPoint after we end. Really want to be responsive to what you guys want to hear about and want to be talking about. So please do let me know. And as I said, I will send around the resources, but if there's anything you need, reach out to me, and they'll also be on farmertofarmer.org. Any other? Great. Then with that, I think we'll wrap things up. Thanks again to everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Yep.
Thanks, guys.